If every country's in debt, who gets the money? Here's something that should bother you more than it probably does. Every major country on Earth is in debt. The United States owes over $38 trillion, the highest it has ever been. Japan is sitting at nearly $9 trillion. The European Union has around $14 trillion. And it isn't just the usual suspects. Saudi Arabia, which sits on one of the largest oil reserves in human history, is in debt. Germany, which has built its entire national identity around fiscal discipline, is in debt. China, which manufactures half the things the world buys, is in debt. Every single one of them owes money. So here's the question. If every country on the planet is on the borrowing side of the ledger, who's on the other side? Who is actually owed? Where does $315 trillion, nearly 3 times the size of the entire global economy, actually end up? Because it has to go somewhere. Money doesn't just vanish into a spreadsheet. Someone is collecting. Someone holds the other end of this. And when you trace it all the way back, the answer is one of the strangest things in modern finance. The year is 1694. England is locked in an expensive war with France, and the royal coffers are nearly empty. There's no modern tax system capable of filling them fast enough. The monarchy needs money immediately, not eventually. So a deal is struck. A group of wealthy merchants agree to lend the English crown a substantial sum. In exchange, they receive something new, like a formal tradable promise from the government to pay them back with interest, funded by the future tax collection. To administer this arrangement, a new institution is created on the spot, the Bank of England. This is the invention that quietly changes everything. For the first time, a government could mobilize resources it had not yet earned. It could fight wars, build infrastructure, and expand influence, all on the strength of a promise. And crucially, that promise could be bought and sold by others. It had a market. It had a market. It had a price. Other nations take notice immediately. The model travels across Europe, across the Atlantic, into the machinery of the newly formed United States. Within a generation, borrowing stops being a sign that a government is failing. It becomes a sign that a government is functional. A nation that can issue debt is a nation that is trusted. The ability to borrow becomes, effectively, a form of power. 3 centuries later, that logic has not changed. It has simply scaled beyond anything those London merchants could have imagined. Today, the United States alone carries over $38 trillion in debt. Japan sits at nearly $9 trillion. The European Union at roughly $14 trillion. And these figures don't sit still. They compound quietly in the background while politicians debate budgets and citizens go about their lives. So again, who is collecting on all of this? The answer, when you actually trace the money, is deeply counterintuitive. Take American debt as the clearest case study. Of the roughly $38 trillion total, about half is held by the public, meaning actual investors, not internal government accounts. Of those investors, the overwhelming majority are American. Domestic banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve itself hold most of it. The foreign slice is around $9 trillion and includes Japan at approximately $1 trillion, China at around $800 billion, and a handful of European financial centers after that. The number you hear constantly, that America is somehow in hock to Beijing, reflects about 2% of total debt. Not nothing, but not the crisis it's made out to be. The more honest picture is this. America largely owes money to America. The government issues bonds. Domestic institutions buy them. The Federal Reserve purchases them back when needed, creating dollars in the process. Taxpayers fund the interest. That interest ends up in pension accounts that those same taxpayers depend on in retirement. The money moves in a loop. The borrower and the lender are in many cases the same entity wearing different hats. And this isn't unique to the United States. It's the structure of the entire global financial order. Follow the chain and it starts to look almost circular. Japan buys American bonds. The US channels money into Europe through multilateral institutions. Europe finances developing nations. Those developing nations hold their reserves in American and European instruments, funneling money right back. Every country is lending to someone who is lending to someone who is eventually lending back to them. There is no endpoint, no single vault somewhere with all the world's IOUs stacked inside. It is a network of mutual obligations so intertwined that pulling on any one thread risks unraveling something much larger. The debt doesn't belong to one creditor, it circulates. But circulation requires a referee, someone who decides which countries get to borrow at low rates and which ones get squeezed. That role belongs to financial markets and, more specifically, to the institutions that move within them. Sovereign wealth funds, hedge funds, pension managers, and central banks collectively control assets that dwarf the GDP of most nations. These are the entities that look at a government's balance sheet and decide in real time whether that government is creditworthy. Their judgment doesn't come through elections or diplomacy. It comes through bond yields. When confidence holds, a country borrows cheaply and governs normally. When confidence breaks, the consequences arrive fast and without mercy. Greece found this out in 2010. The numbers stopped adding up. Institutional investors pulled back, and borrowing costs spiked to levels that made normal government function impossible. What followed was nearly a decade of enforced austerity, cuts to pensions, healthcare, public services imposed, not by Greek voters, but by the conditions attached to the international bailout. A sovereign nation's domestic policy, rewritten by the terms of its debt. Argentina has lived a version of this story multiple times. Sri Lanka collapsed entirely in 2022 when it ran out of foreign currency to pay for imports, let alone service its loans. When the system breaks down, the invisible creditor suddenly has a very specific face and a very specific list of demands. Yet, even after these collapses, the pattern restores itself. New loans replace old ones. Restructured debt gets issued again under different terms. The machine resets. This is the part that most people find genuinely difficult to accept. Governments are not planning to pay off their debt. Not in 10 years. Not in 50. Not ever. This is not a scandal or a secret. It is the stated, understood reality of how sovereign finance operates. When an individual borrows money, the expectation is repayment of the full amount. When a government borrows money, the expectation is something different entirely. The debt gets rolled forward. Old bonds mature and new ones replace them immediately. The principal never disappears. It just gets refinanced into the next cycle. What governments actually pay is the interest. That interest is the real transaction. It is the ongoing cost of being considered stable and creditworthy. Japan has operated this way for decades. Its debt exceeds 250% of its entire annual economic output. By any conventional personal finance logic, this should be catastrophic. And yet, Japanese government bonds are considered among the safest investments in the world. Yields stay low. Investors keep buying. Because they're not waiting for Japan to pay them back in full. They are waiting to roll the investment over into the next cycle. The debt is not a problem to be solved. It is a product to be managed. And this is why paying off all the debt would actually be dangerous. If Washington somehow cleared its entire $38 trillion balance tomorrow, something alarming would happen. The world's most widely held financial asset would disappear. Banks that use treasury bonds as collateral would suddenly have nothing to post as security. Pension funds holding government debt as their most stable position would face a hole they couldn't fill. The financial architecture that every market in the world leans on would buckle. The debt, paradoxically, is what makes the system function. Eliminating it would eliminate the foundation. So the goal was never elimination. The goal was always credibility. Keeping the debt at a level the market believes can be serviced indefinitely, so that the underlying promise never gets seriously tested. Which brings us back to the original question. Who is the creditor when every country is a debtor? The answer is not a country. It is not a bank or a fund or a government agency. The creditor is the system itself, a web of mutual obligations held together by the shared belief that the promises embedded in it will never all be called in at the same time. And that belief is not evenly distributed. Interest payments do not flow equally. They move from wage earners and taxpayers toward the institutions and individuals that hold the debt. The person whose pension fund owns treasury bonds benefits. The person whose taxes fund the interest payments on those bonds also benefits, but less directly, less visibly, less powerfully. This is how debt at scale of nations becomes something more than a financial arrangement. It becomes a structural feature of how wealth is organized and who gets to accumulate it. The world doesn't owe money to a villain sitting somewhere counting receipts. It owes money to itself unevenly, invisibly, and with no agreed-upon date for settlement. That is the system. And so far, the system's only non-negotiable requirement is that enough people keep believing in it. The moment they stop, the number stops mattering. And we find out very quickly what a promise looks like when it finally breaks. If this changed how you think about global debt, make sure to subscribe to our channel. It helps more people find this video. And if you thought this was interesting, wait until you see this next.